Jackson.
Well, good afternoon. My mic up and going? Good afternoon. How are you all? I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, and I welcome all of you and also welcome our distinguished panelists for what I promise you will be an illuminating and in some ways intriguing discussion about one of the most important topics that we are going to face in the high-tech frontier over the next several decades, which is the future of 5G technology and the important role of American leadership in this sector. This is a topic which has taken on not just economic and technological importance, given the new kinds of devices, the unimaginable, in some ways unimaginable speed with which 5G will be able to deliver the kinds of access to internet, to provide the kind of amazing level of bandwidth that at this point is almost difficult to imagine. And of course, the economic consequences of such a technological revolution are ones that we're only just beginning to appreciate and understand. But as you'll see from the course of our discussion, and one of the key reasons why we want to talk about this today is that there are also profound geopolitical implications with this, because in the race to secure and develop 5G technology and networks, the United States is not the only competitor in this race. We also have a very serious competitor who is pressing ahead in this direction in ways that, as I think you will see in the course of this afternoon, are ones that the U.S. is bound to respond to, and challenges that affect not only the United States and its economies, but are going to have profound consequences across the globe at the same time. So to bring you up to speed with this discussion and with the way in which the issue of 5G technology plays into the larger picture of the U.S.'s race for high-tech supremacy with the People's Republic of China, what we've done is to pull together a panel who will be able to explore this issue in depth and in ways that I think by the time you and our web audience leave, you will have a deeper understanding of just why this is so important to American national security, American economic security, and also to our stance of alliances around the world. For our panel, we've got with us an addition from the original invitation here. We've also brought with us, and we're delighted to have with us, Bryan Hendricks, who is head of policy and public affairs for Nokia in the Americas region, who's responsible for regulatory and legislative developments impacting technology, innovation, and deployment, including spectrum allocation, which, as you're going to find out, is one of the most important aspects, maybe the salient aspect, when it comes to understanding the impact of 5G technology. Bryan spent nearly 2 decades with regulatory and legislative experience dealing with technology policy issues. He was an enforcement lawyer with the Federal Communications Commission. And prior to joining Nokia, Bryan served as staff director of the United States Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, where he also served as general counsel. And that, from the point of view of where we are on the Hill on these issues, is one of the key decision makers in what takes place here. This is also a good time to remind you all to turn off cell phones and to make sure you're shut down here so that we're able to proceed without interruption from that point of view. Also joining us at the same time is a newcomer to Washington, Karl Rove.
A newcomer.
Many of you probably don't know that, but it was a big thrill for me yesterday to give him a tour of the city His delight in seeing the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial were really intense. Although I have to tell,
the White House. I've
when I had
always wanted to go there.
yeah, I know, but when I had to tell him that Grant's tomb was actually in New York and not here, his disappointment was deep. But he seems to recover from that. Of course, I'm joking. Karl Rove is one of the has been over the last 2 decades one of the key figures in the shaping the not only policy in a couple of White Houses, but also in understanding and the direction of policy in the U.S. He was senior advisor to President George Bush from 2000 to 2007. That's George W. Bush, and deputy chief of staff from 2004 to 2007. He oversaw the Office of Strategic Initiatives, Political Affairs, Public Liaison, and Intergovernmental Affairs. Today, he writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal, and he's author of the New York Times bestseller, Courage and Consequence, My Life as a Conservative in the Fight. He also serves on the University of Texas Chancellor's Council of Executive Committee and on the Board of Trustees for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation. He was inducted into, this is something I did not know, he was inducted into the Scandinavian American Hall of Fame in 2009. Karl and I share one characteristic, and that is we are both of Norwegian American descent. So that's an honor which is not only one that I could admire, but perhaps one I can aspire to at a future date. We'll see. Maybe with Karl's help, I can see what happens with that. And the American Association of Political Consultants Hall of Fame in 2012. Sitting next to Karl, we're very pleased to have with us Declan Ganley, who is the CEO of Rivada Networks. Declan moved from Ireland to London, where he worked in construction and insurance instead of going to college. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, he traveled to Russia, where he founded and then sold a forestry business before moving on to the telecoms industry. And that's where he's been, and that's where he's been immersed himself ever since. It was in 2004 that he founded Rivada Networks, a U.S.-based firm specializing in the provision of telecommunications systems to the military, the police, and emergency services in disaster situations. And for Rivada's work in deploying emergency communication systems in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Declan was awarded the Louisiana Distinguished Service Medal. And then finally, we have with us as well Harold Furchtgott-Roth. From 1997 to 2001, Harold served as a commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. In that capacity, he served on the Joint Board of Universal Service. He's actually one of the few economists who've served as a federal regulatory commissioner, which comes as a considerable surprise when you think about it, that should be so, but there it is. And the only one to have served in the FCC. From 2001 to 2003, he was a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he completed the writing of A Tough Act to Follow, which was about his earlier work in the House Communications Committee, implementing the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was one of the most important and revolutionary acts in dealing with telecommunications in our country's history. But I'm delighted to say that we've now got him, and that he is now a scholar at the Hudson Institute. And I'm proud to include Harold as a colleague and as a friend. So for the course of our discussion, what I thought we would do is have each of our panelists talk about their perspective on this issue of American leadership in the 5G technology, of the challenges that leadership faces, and the ways in which we can extend and direct that. And I thought I would begin our discussion with Harold.
Well, first of all, Arthur, thank you so much for that very warm introduction, and thank you very much for organizing this panel. It's great to have this issue here at Hudson. It's very important for the United States. And I think you wanted me to begin by just talking about what is 5G. 5G stands for fifth generation technology. There have been 5 generations of wireless technology, roughly, you could say, one every 5 years or so. 5G replaces 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G. Those technologies were very well defined within a specific band, frequency band of spectrum, and had incremental amounts of capabilities, faster speeds, greater capacity, greater reach. 5G is a change. It's different from the prior generations. It will have substantially more capacity, but instead of being sort of channelized into sort of saying we're going to use this particular band to provide services, you can use multiple bands of spectrum for 5G, and you can use it in ways that you can splice the capacity to use it for different purposes, to use it for different users. It has a lot more capability than prior technologies have had. It will require new equipment. It will require new networks, all of which are going to cost a lot of money. And countries around the world, businesses around the world are racing to deploy 5G technology. In the United States, all of the major carriers have plans for 5G networks, and we're seeing just the very first beginnings of it. The other big difference I would say about 5G technology is that unlike prior generations where you could say, these are the specific bands and only these bands can be used for, say, 4G LTE, 5G is still, there are lots of different bands that are being developed for it, and we haven't seen the end. We don't know the ends of where 5G technology will ultimately be used.
Quick technical question for you. We talk about 5G, we talk about it as a wireless technology, and yet so much of the discussion about the cost and infrastructure involved in 5G focuses on fiber optic cable and fiber optic cable. What's the link between those two technologies? How does that work?
Well, all wireless technologies from 1G to 5G all require what's called backhaul. It's not that all of the network is being done wirelessly, although in theory it could be. In practice, it isn't. It's to interconnect with the rest of the internet, fiber-based networks around the globe, and being able to connect those networks requires not just the wireless infrastructure to go from a cell site to a handset, but it requires a fiber network from the cell sites to the rest of the internet.
And from a regulatory point of view, who is it who's got the final oversight over what unfolds and takes place?
It's the usual regulators. In the United States, it's the FCC and regulatory agencies in countries around the world.
And the kind of spectrum that we're talking about is going to require a lot more spectrum than 3G and 4G, and how will carriers and users have access to that additional spectrum? How would that work?
Well, different bands of spectrum are being used for 5G in different countries around the world. Here in the United States, we have an auction that's just about to begin for some very high frequency spectrum. Lots of new bands are being opened up. A lot of the high frequency bands have very short distances, and they're very useful in urban environments, but they're not very useful in less dense environments.
And one last technical question on that for you, and that is one of the other sort of things that people talk about that will be facilitated through the rollout of 5G technology, in addition to the incredible speed with which you'll be able to have access to the internet and to services provided, is also the way in which this will become fundamental, what they call the Internet of Things. and to the whole range of devices which will now be able to be sort of plugged into the internet. We think about Internet of Things today in terms of things like the smart regulator for temperature in your home and for a variety of appliances, but we're really looking through 5G for a big expansion in terms of Internet of Things access, correct?
I would say this is kind of a semantic issue, whether Internet of Things is the same as 5G. In my vocabulary, they're different. There are two things going on. One is the ubiquity of attached devices into the internet, and that's called Internet of Things. Every consumer electronic device is going to be connected into the internet in some ways. A lot of that connectivity doesn't necessarily require a lot of speed or a lot of bandwidth. It can be done with often very simple types of connections. 5G, I usually think of as enormous capacity, enormous throughput, low latency, things that will certainly include the Internet of Things, but not necessarily.
And latency, just one more point on that, latency being the kind of delay that you experience with regard to, let's say, internet to phone service and so on because of the curvature of the Earth and where you are geographically. That is going to diminish significantly as a result of this technology.
Yes.
Yeah. Bryan, did you have something?
I just wanted to frame a little bit more what Harold was, talking about. So if you think about the past generations of wireless technology, the primary use case was the consumer. And we were thinking about things like connectivity, internet access, high-speed data, reliable voice. But you had real limits to the technical capabilities of those networks based in part on the choices of the spectrum using single bands. You wouldn't have had the throughput or the speeds or the reliability to do some of the use cases that you've been reading a lot about that require no latency, everything from remote diagnostic healthcare to autonomous driving vehicles, et cetera. 5G really opens the options box for us because it's going to use different spectrum bands for different purposes in different locations to give us flexibility. We need 10x at least capacity, and we need to drive the latency down close to zero. And in order to do that, you will use different spectrum in different locations. Millimeter wave for urban locations are not ideal for suburban and rural deployments. So you'll need multiple bands. But the key here is to recognize that with this huge growth in capacity and flexibility for managing networks, a lot of those use cases that 5 years ago were science fiction become a reality.
And what we're talking about too, again, is something which is not going to be just limited to the U.S. or North America. We're talking about a global transformation as a result of 5G technology. And what the dimensions of that global realization look like and what the landscape will look in terms of who dominates things is one of the topics that I think we want to talk about today. And there I thought I would turn it over to Declan Ganley to talk about from where you are and from your perspective involved in telecommunications business, both in Europe but also here, what that landscape is beginning to look like.
Sure. So just to put it into a bit of context, Rivada holds a number of key patents for 5G across the world, in the US and even in China. What we've watched over the last year is fascinating. Think about another way to think about 5G, and Harold is right, it's not just about the Internet of Things, is potentially 1 million plus 2 million connected devices per square mile in certain circumstances. Some of those things doing very, moving information that's a tiny amount of information and off-peak times, and other devices moving huge amounts of information at other times of the day. And it's necessary to look at the international field and what's gone on in the context of the history over the last 20 years, really, of the wireless industry. So in Europe, you had the 3G license auctions that raised a huge amount of money for governments. That took money out of the private sector, moved that money into governments, and started to slow down the amount of money that was available to deploy networks, and that otherwise might have gone into dropping the price of capacity. And yet price has come down, but carriers have been squeezed. And carriers have been squeezed all over the world. And there wouldn't be agreement on this panel, for example, uniform agreement on this issue, but our experience of this has been that as we have seen carriers get squeezed, carriers have decided not to move off a retail consumer model, but stick to their guns with the retail consumer model, have wholesale as really a almost despised part of but necessary part of their businesses, but have focused on retail. And that focus on retail has resulted in a situation where this has become about propping up price, the price of a gigabit, and that being an equation of the difference between producing a gigabit and what you can sell it for. So what's the cost of production, what's the price, and keeping that spread as wide as possible. And it's an interesting situation. If I can pull up a few slides here, because in that effort to prop up price, we have not seen a shift to MVNO or wholesale in a way that was originally expected when MVNOs were first being talked about. And so we now have a situation where in the US, I'm trying to pull up, hang on a second, here we go. In the US, we have a market of the median gigabyte price that looks like this. So amongst the OECD and EU 49, the US has the highest median price per gigabit in the world. Now, there are one or two sort of outlying markets of countries that, frankly, don't have very big economies that would be more expensive than this. But this is an interesting graphic. And there's a lot of data out there that supports this, that you end up in a situation where price is as high as it is, and where the price in certain markets in Europe, France, for example, or Italy, the barrier to entry is a lot lower. So carriers are getting squeezed, and they're getting squeezed all over the world, and a carrier that's getting squeezed on its margin because it's focused on a retail model is looking to find margin, is looking to cut costs wherever it can. So one of the places that you look to cut costs is in the cost of your next generation of equipment. So if you're going to roll out a 5G network, where do you go for the equipment? And what we have found is that the Chinese government, to make a long story short, is prepared to subsidize the cost of equipment to an unprecedented degree. And not only are they prepared to subsidize the cost of the equipment, they're prepared to subsidize the cost of financing that equipment. So
this is a very capital intensive enterprise. Hugely
capital intensive that you're putting out, and 5G, I mean, rough rule of thumb, about 100 times faster than 4G. It requires more points of presence. Okay, you don't have to have as many tall towers, but you need more individual sites. It's an expensive, capital intensive business. So your cost of equipment is a huge part of being in business and staying in business, and your cost of financing is hugely important as well. So if you want extremely sweet, 100%, 100+%, so more than 100% of your equipment costs vendor financed, the Chinese will vendor finance your equipment at really unprecedented levels. And what has happened is carriers focused on this retail-centric model have become de facto, and it's not their fault, but they've become Trojan horses for Chinese 5G technology. And they've become Trojan horses because they're the guys that will go in and do the lobbying. It's not going to be somebody that flies in from Shenzhen or Shanghai to do the lobbying. It's going to be somebody that went to Eton with the deputy minister. And in the UK, for example, you have a situation where publicly announced Three, which is owned by Hudson Whampoa, a Hong Kong company, has announced that it's going to do its 5G rollout with Huawei. Not publicly announced, but our information is that that EE, the other carrier, another one of the carriers in the UK, is doing the same thing, is going to go with Huawei, and that Vodafone is going with Huawei outside of everywhere except Greater London. So the rest of the UK will be a Huawei 5G network. And the countries here filled in red, and I think there's now 61 of them. That map represents the countries that have already signed 5G contracts to deploy their 5G networks using Chinese equipment, and primarily Huawei equipment. The countries that are pink are countries that are currently testing that equipment in government-approved testing operations, but that are, if you like, leaning in that direction right now. This is based upon publicly available information. For example, although Ireland is now coloured in red, it's a country where I happen to live, it has not been announced that the main carriers in Ireland have signed for their 5G networks with Huawei, but we know that that has happened. So because we have this carrier-centric, retail-based pricing model that's seeking to prop up the price of the gigabyte, you're looking to, in a market where retail wireless is 100% penetrated. So in many markets, either everybody that could possibly have a device already has one, and some people have more than one device. So where do you go? Where do you go in a situation where you're trying to sell a $60 or a $50 a month plan to somebody? And what I suggest, and what Rivada suggests, is what you go is you actually flip the model. And you say that capacity is there, let the market tell you what it's worth, and clear that capacity at any price. Because there are devices that will have a business model for $5 a month. There are devices that will have a business model at 50 cents a year, but if that capacity is there and it's not being sold, sell it, let the market clear it. And we believe that it's going to take something dramatic like that, changing the model of how we sell capacity to flip the model and prevent China from owning the cyber domain. Because make no mistake, whoever controls, whoever architects these 5G networks, remember they're going to be connecting in some cases 1 million+ devices a square mile in some city environments. Whoever architects those networks and deploys those networks has got an advantage in the cyber domain. And the cyber domain is the edge of any security network. So you've got land as a military domain, sea, air, space, and now cyber. So those networks must be secure. They've got to be ultra secure, because our first and primary point of vulnerability. You know, the next Pearl Harbor, the next 10 minutes of the next Great War, forget, you know, God forbid there should ever be one, but it's likely that the first 10 minutes of the next Great War will be fought first in the cyber domain. That's how important this is. And that's how important it is that we get this right, that we make sure that these networks are absolutely secure. And we make the case that the way that you do that is by ensuring you have an economic model where the private sector can sustain and fund networks, 5G networks, 6G networks, that are sustainably fundable, and that they will have the money to pay for the security. And because we have a broken business model for wireless, we have made ourselves vulnerable to this hack by trying to prop up the price of a gigabyte. We have created this huge vulnerability. Let's use what we do best in the West, which is bottom up. Let's use the free market. Let's use free market pricing to find out what the value is, to clear capacity at that value. And we believe, and we've modeled this in great detail, that that produces revenue that otherwise is not being seen. And that revenue is what companies will use to pay for the equipment and pay for the security that will make these networks secure, and to detach ourselves from the vulnerability that has been created and that, frankly, the Chinese government has hacked to be able to come in and say, we'll give you cheap stuff, we'll give you cheap money, leave it to us. In the UK, in some European markets, not only are the likes of Huawei funding, providing discounted equipment and discounted funding, even the rollout cost. That's where the concrete is being poured, the towers are being built. We have reliable information that they're coming in 40% cheaper than the next nearest competitor. The only way you can be doing that is if you're even subsidizing the rollout cost. Because a British contractor is not going to charge less to Huawei than it'll charge to Ericsson or to Nokia. So that's being subsidized. So there is, I believe, a deliberate policy of subsidization. That deliberate policy is to knock guys like Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung out of the market. It's to make people cut corners on things like security, and it is to assert control in this essential security domain, the cyber domain, and get into the edge of that network. We cannot allow that to happen. We have to flip the model. And if we don't flip the model, I believe by the end of February, which is Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, it will be too late. These decisions are being made. These contracts are being signed. In the UK, it's very hard. The British government has, a lot of this stuff is in the public domain. It's very difficult once you have made this decision and you've started to go down the road to reverse that decision. It's like getting, your jaw drilled for dental implants, having a whole new set put in, and then somebody telling you you've got to rip them all out. That's very hard to do once it's done. So these decisions are being made now. I expect that there's going to, already 61 countries have announced that they're going this way. In many cases, I think those are still reversible decisions because those deployments haven't been made, but we don't have much time and action needs to be taken now.
You talk about business models. I mean, the Chinese definitely have a business model here, don't they?
Yeah.
Which has been laid out in the 19th Party Congress with the Made in China 2025 plan. That China very much has a comprehensive strategy of dominating the world's high-tech frontier, whether you're talking about 5G or if you're talking about AI, artificial intelligence, or quantum, or robotics. In all of these areas, China sees this as part of a larger picture, which is that 5G will give them command and proprietary stake, the lead proprietary stake in the world's telecommunications network. And as we know, that's an issue from the point of view of security, let alone from the point of view of the economy, of the economics involved, that for example, our armed services who will look forward to being able to use 5G networks in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, to know that they'll be sharing that information across those 5G networks that are wired by Chinese companies, specifically by Huawei, is not going to make them feel very comfortable about the information and the networks in which they would have to rely. And they're not in a position, the intelligence services and military services aren't in a position to create their own networks. They're going to be in a very difficult situation.
You can see in the UK right now this debate playing out. It's in the Financial Times almost every day for the last couple of weeks, where you have the government issuing a letter asking the carriers to effectively back off. They don't name China, but everybody knows what it means. And the carriers coming out very aggressively and asserting, no, we won't back off. We've paid money in auctions for these licenses. And by the way, they've paid money in auctions for these licenses, building business models that are dependent on Chinese financing and Chinese equipment. So there's big pushback from the carriers. The Australian government, to give them enormous credit, has been very bold in understanding just the scale of the threat that's taking place and putting in a blanket ban on Huawei and on Chinese vendors. And I believe that that's a model that needs to be copied right across the Western world. This is, as I say, it's a key military domain as well as a key economic domain. Huge parts of our economy are going to be dependent upon this kind of connectivity. We cannot compromise the security of that by taking the cheap option now and really having carriers through regulatory capture become Trojan horses for Chinese technology and Chinese government policy, which is to assert exactly the type of control and influence across the whole of the technology domain that is not a secret. This is publicly available, announced information. We're not up here spinning a conspiracy theory. They've said they want to do this.
Bryan, you've seen this play out firsthand. Full disclosure, of course, Nokia is a competitor in this 5G rollout with Huawei, looking to compete in different continents and in different countries. From where your perspective is, and for where you've watched this process play out firsthand, two key questions for you. One is Declan's description of how the Chinese are able to leverage these key advantages accurate? And number two is the kind of shift in a model to a different way of allocating spectrum, a realistic one as a means by which we sort of break the momentum that China already has in this area.
Well, thank you. So two hard questions to answer. With respect to what's actually been playing out, we do business in some 150 countries. And for those that don't know, Nokia, late of the handset days, has been built back into probably the only, in our estimation, company which can compete with the Chinese vendors over the long term, because we have a full complement of equipment and services end to end, which only the Chinese have, and we have that capability. So we actively pursue deals all across the world. We have won quite a few deals working head-to-head against the Chinese, and we're in trials now for many others. But Declan is not wrong about some of the advantages that China has. For example, it's really a whole China approach. Not to cast aspersions, but it isn't just a carrier that shows up in a Latin American country and makes a push. It's a banking system. It's a diplomatic presence. It's a multi-sectoral, cross-sectoral approach with energy companies and the web-scale companies. And the push is, look at all of the economies of scale, look at all the advantages, look at the cheap equipment that we can provide. And then there's also diplomatic pressure. There's investment in the civil infrastructure of countries that are struggling financially to prop up university research, large S. And we've seen this model where in Africa, particularly for 3G and 4G, it was quite successful. Those markets are heavily dominated by the Chinese. And you see a certain amount of buyer's remorse expressed by some of those African countries now, that essentially they like Western choices, but those markets have become very difficult for companies like ours to compete in. And so we're seeing that same approach being deployed in Latin America in particular, where Nokia is obviously very strong. Some of those countries are struggling significantly to figure out, how do we participate in digitalization of our economy? We need infrastructure, and we're struggling financially. Enter the whole China model, which is an extremely attractive approach. We have failed as Western governments and Western suppliers to be able to meet that challenge head on by working collaboratively to bring different monetization models, to bring diplomatic, to do cross-sectoral presentations of an entire ecosystem that would give choices to these countries. And so Declan isn't wrong in the sense that we've been slow to respond to that. And there are some things that really in the next 6 months or so need to change dramatically, or we think some of those countries are going to go the way Africa has. And so we're interested in participating in a lot of those conversations. It's difficult to compete, but not impossible to compete. The quality of our equipment, they may disagree with this, is better still. But there are some built-in advantages when you protect your home market to the tune of 70+% of the equipment market being given to Chinese suppliers. And when you consider roughly 2/3 of all base stations are in mainland China on the planet Earth, it's a real big advantage in terms of being able to float an R&D budget that dwarfs what Western suppliers are able to offer, and to be insulated in many respects from the downturn that we saw at the end of LTE deployments, where companies stopped investing to gear up for 5G. So operationally, there are some strong advantages, and you've seen the suppliers from the Western side have to consistently restructure our businesses to take costs out of our business to remain competitive. We think we're pretty well positioned, but there's no question that a concerted effort from the United States and Western governments to present an alternative to the whole China model would be very advantageous for Western suppliers in terms of being able. In terms of spectrum, excuse me, I think there will be strong resistance among our customers to the idea of changing a business model to a wholesale model, as Declan points out. But what is clear is that monetization has become quite difficult in this space. We looked at the end of LTE for a better description of what was happening in the market. We saw two key indicators, average revenue per user and return on capital employed, flat or falling in most of our markets. And that's a really tough set of economics for a carrier to justify an enormous expense of acquiring spectrum for auction or the next round of commercial deployments of equipment to upgrade your network. So there's no question that monetization remains a challenge. One thing that has to happen is we have to be judicious in the regulatory choices we make that don't constrain operators from doing some experimental things like prioritization of traffic. That feeds into the net neutrality debate that we've talked about, because those economics remain very difficult. I don't know if what Declan proposes is something in the mid to long term that can happen. I do know there will be culturally a significant opposition to it among our customers. But I think I see these issues as two important issues, but two different issues. Think in the short run, which is to say the next 6 months, maybe 9, maybe less in some places, the die will be cast for what the equipment market and services market looks like globally. It isn't too late for some governments to make different decisions about their deployment. The one thing that I think is clear, and I think this is important to say, I see we've got some folks from governments here. Our message is very simple. You don't start in a place where for Nokia or Ericsson or Samsung or Juniper or Cisco that you need to create a cybersecurity center to review our equipment and to attempt to do very difficult things like go out into a network to look at code every time it is updated to see that it isn't nefarious. You start in a position of trust with us as a supplier that you simply don't have with the Chinese. Each government has their own reasons for reaching those conclusions, but many of them have reached those conclusions. And I think our view is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to mitigate security risks in these new rounds of networks that are put there purposefully. And I'm not suggesting they are. I'm just saying if you believe there is a risk of that in certain suppliers, we don't believe that is easy to mitigate. We think if you can't start in a position of trust, and we have a 153-year heritage, right, as a company, then you have some difficult choices, because I think when we look and forecast what will be running on top of these networks, it's not just you and me and our consumer use case. The premise behind 5G is to drive the verticals. It's to drive remote diagnostic healthcare and digitalization of entire sectors of the economy. The sheer volume of data that will transit these networks is almost incomprehensible to us at this point. So if you can't start from a position of trust, then you're nowhere.
One more question, then I'm going to turn to Karl. Very quickly on the issue of standards and 5G standards as part of, if you like, the contest now between China and the West. How important is it to have kind of robust standards, and who sets those standards? How important is that as to who ultimately wins this contest? Did everyone get the question that I had posed with regard to the role of standards in these things?
Are you just addressing me?
No, I'm talking to Bryan.
Oh, you said Karl.
No,
So,
I had one more question for you
Oh.
before I shift over to Karl.
I understand. I think
Thank God.
You just didn't
I
want
was
to
really
answer the
nervous
question.
there for a moment.
I was actually sitting here very eager
Which
to hear
would be understandable.
I was very eager to hear what Karl was going to say in response to that question. So we've heard a lot about standardization. There's been a lot of hand-wringing about the rise of Chinese participation in standardization. And I think what we have said to the U.S. government and to others is, let's pump the brakes a little bit. A couple of key things to think about. One of which is standards bodies are places where, for most of the recent past, the best engineering decisions drive how we approach things from a sector. And so what you want to look at as an indication of whether that process continues to be based on the best engineering solutions as opposed to being driven by company or region specific desires to dominate a technology is not just body count of how many people are there. There's no question that Asia writ large now is sending far more people to standards bodies. You want to take a look at leadership and study groups. You want to take a look at actual IP that is being declared and created, because some people are just kind of throwing IP declarations out there, but it's quantity over quality. And you want to take a look at what we call change requests, which is during the deliberations of a study group, how many inputs that are being made as potential suggestions for the standard are ultimately accepted, kind of like a shooting percentage for a basketball player. When you look across those things, what you see is we're still getting the outcomes that we want. We're still getting engineering-based solutions, but that does not mean that there are not some worrying signs. The participation rate and level from entities in the Americas has stagnated, even as we've seen an exponential growth from Asia. And so we do need a greater level of participation. And to do that, you have to make it more affordable for small and mid-sized businesses to participate. Getting voting rights in standards bodies, not debilitating for us, but certainly for startups and smaller companies is very difficult. So you might want to take a look at the tax code and things that you can do to encourage more participation for small and mid-sized companies, and also the verticals. This is an area where the United States will retain, for the short run anyway, a comparative advantage over the rest of the world. Web scale, healthcare, intelligent transportation. Those entities share significant interest in the outcome of these standards bodies, but by and large, they are not currently participating. And so we need to find ways to encourage, even at the risk of our own relative influence being diminished a bit, to get a broader participation level there. The answer is not to get more government involvement in standards bodies. We want to keep the politics out of standards bodies. They work best when smart engineers make these choices and decisions. I don't think we're at a bad tipping point, but we also cannot ignore the fact that Asia is rising in supremacy. And it is, by the way, part of the 2025 strategy to essentially dominate standards development.
Yep. And we see that, for example, with regard to quantum technology standards. And one of the reasons why our Quantum Alliance initiative has been very active in this and developing a set of standards for quantum random numbers generator and quantum key distribution, even though these are still emerging technologies and won't be deployed QKD for at least another decade, it becomes important, and it's been communicated to us by regulatory bodies that they want to see standards established ahead of time before a certain other country steps in order to push its standards, the one that meets its engineering practices and commercial practices involved in that process. And one of the things that we have found is that it's not that difficult to put together an international consortium of companies that are involved in QKD and QRNG, because they do realize that with American leadership, it becomes possible to really take the initiative away from other countries in this development. And it's a little bit tighter fit with regard to 5G, because 5G is, we're really on the cusp of that, if it's not here already. But at the same time, being able to sort of set standards that provide for kind of seamless interoperability across countries, across companies. This is a very, very important part of that contest. And in this regard, the United States, well, in our case, QRNG and QKD, there aren't a lot of American companies that are involved. So you're by necessity, one draws an international consortium with it. But even in that case, it can be the United States that takes the lead and that points the way forward and shows what's possible and what needs to be done. And that brings us then to Karl Rove, thinking about the role of a U.S. leadership in this area. I think it's clear to all of our panelists, and I hope to our audience, that U.S. leadership is going to be a keen necessity going forward here. So from you're looking at this situation, looking at the technology, looking at the challenges involved, what are the levers that the U.S. can use as part of that leadership process?
First of all, thanks for having me. I'm in the competition to be the least experienced and expert member of the panel. I have a runaway lead. So I enjoy being here, and thanks for having me. I sort of stumbled into this issue at the White House in the aftermath of 9/11. You may remember the 9/11 Commission report found two difficulties on that day in New York. One is the interoperability. The equipment of the various departments didn't talk to each other. And more importantly, because that issue gets solved by us all moving towards wireless, but the other issue was that the amount of spectrum available for communications was simply inadequate. And as a result, communications collapsed. And so in the aftermath of that, Michael Jackson and others began an effort to identify spectrum that could be set aside for a first responder network. And so I began to see this issue. First of all, how difficult it was to identify spectrum in the hands of the government that could be converted to this use, and then to clear it by moving the functions that were then in that spectrum out. I mean, it took the better part of a decade to free up 20 megahertz of spectrum that was largely unused, that was in the hands of DOD and Commerce and the Weather, Ag, I think, a couple of others. But it opened my eyes to a couple of issues. One is how critical and how critical to our economy in the future access to spectrum is, and what a perishable commodity it is, and how inefficiently we use it. And it's one of the things that ultimately led me to an association with Declan, because this question of how do we, God is not creating any more spectrum, and yet our demand is growing at 50% of the year and likely to accelerate as we download more videos and the Internet of Things comes on, and precision agriculture and all these other things that we're not just talking about but getting ready to do or already beginning to do begin to take up spectrum. So I'm interested in this because there is an issue of how do we more efficiently use spectrum than our current model, and I want to come back to that in a minute. But you ask about our strategic competition with the Chinese on this. I mean, the 19th Congress, we want world leadership on these technologies in the future. By 2025, we want to command the heights. This is not an economic threat alone to the United States. This is a strategic, a geopolitical threat to the United States that has to be met with a geopolitical response. And there are advantages of having a command and control economy. And we see a lot of those in that map with 61 countries. They are methodically bribing, cutting deals, offering sweeteners to get themselves to that kind of advantage in places where they shouldn't have. Now, some of it is reversible, a lot of it is reversible, but 61 countries signing agreements to either test their equipment or to let them deploy the networks is a problem. But a command and control economy also has weaknesses, and we see it in four things that we can exploit. One is they got a reputation for shoddy equipment and shoddy deployment, and we can exploit that by having a better product. They are the debt dependency instances in Africa and Asia are causing some people to have doubts about whether or not they want to be further dependent upon the Chinese. We saw this become an issue, for example, in the Brazilian election, where the ultimate winner was a clear skeptic about did Brazil want to engage in more deals with the Chinese that made them more debt dependent upon China. The third thing is the Chinese, even for a thing like this, don't have enough money. So they're going to have to get other people's money into this. And some of that is going to come from international lending institutions, and some of it is going to come from the private sector. And the weakness there is that both of those sources of money, if they've got a better alternative, are going to be more likely to fund the things that come with a better alternative. And finally, then the security questions, which we barely touched on here today, and we could have spent a lot of time talking about, but we would probably have to have most of us excluded from the room, and they'd have to have a meeting in a skiff someplace in order to discuss them. But imagine situational awareness of America's defense posture moving across a network that passes through lots of Chinese equipment. I remember in 2001 and 2 and 3 being surprised how much information we were picking up about Al-Qaeda and other adversaries of the United States that was passing through U.S. networks and being plucked out of the ether here in the United States. Imagine what the Chinese would be able to do if they dominate most of the backbone of 5G around the world. So these things all combined, I think, if we have proper U.S. leadership into supporting an alternative. And there may be several alternatives. The one I'm an advocate of is an open access wholesale wireless market where people can, in essence, bid for the use of that unused spectrum, that perishable commodity that's residing on all those towers, and do so in an electronic marketplace, because then it makes it, that chart that showed that the U.S. is near the top of the heap or at the top of the heap in major industrialized country in the cost per gigabyte, there's a reason why, because we got a model that basically is a duopoly between two big carriers and then a bunch of carry-alongs behind that. And as a result, they have better and more power over pricing than they would in a truly competitive marketplace. Which brings me to the final point I wanted to make, which is about the carriers themselves. Look, they've done a great job for our country, but they have a model that is yesterday and is not up to this challenge, in my opinion. 5G, they have a 25-year plan for rollout. And a lot of those plans don't cover a lot of the country. So we're going to take this divide that we have today between those that got access to quality broadband and those that don't, and heighten that divide by saying that my hometown of Austin, Texas is going to have 5G early, and Mandan, North Dakota, where the Scandinavian American Hall of Fame is, or excuse me, Minot, North Dakota, where the Scandinavian American Hall of Fame is not. And this is a problem. They have legacy investments in 4G and 3G and a psychological commitment to a model that says when we have spectrum, our object is to use that spectrum only for us, and if we're going to provide it to somebody else, by God, we're going to skin their hide in using it. And if we don't, if some place is uneconomical for us, used to have a ranch in Fort Davis, Texas. You've never been there. It's actually north of Valentine, Texas, population 263. Nearest hospital is 2 hours away. The nearest gas station is 1 hour and 15 minutes away. That part of the country is served by West Texas Telephone, which gets its spectrum from AT&T, because it has a federal subsidy that makes it more attractive to AT&T to say, we'll license you to handle all the business out there in far West Texas, because we'll be able to charge you not the normal and ordinary price that we charge in an urban area, because you get a subsidy, we can get an extra kicker. So they're going to be, whether they like it or not, they're going to be reluctant apologists for the current structure that's allowing the Chinese to get 61 countries and us to get 0, and allow Huawei and ZTE to grow and Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung to shrink in their business to this very important market. So, Game of Thrones is coming on back next summer, and winter is coming there, but Barcelona is coming for 5G, and the United States has got an opportunity between now and then to begin to change the game. Let's see if it does.
I'm glad you mentioned the carriers involved here, because, again, full disclosure, they have been AT&T, Verizon, the Innovation Alliance have been supporters of Hudson Institute in the past. We have a great track record with them. But one of the great advantages of being a nonprofit institution and a think tank, and of a initiative like the Quantum Alliance Initiative, which is able to look at the whole range of technologies and understand their impact from a strategic as well as economic level, is that we're able to open up to new ideas, to have a diversity of views, and to really sort of think about the fundamental problems and issues that underlie all the business models, and also the way in which our government is able to participate and will participate in this new high-tech frontier. Declan, do you have one more thing you want to say?
I was just going to say, a privately funded, privately built wholesale model that was purely wholesale, becomes a resource for carriers. It's actually not a threat to them. They see it as a threat right now. It will actually become a resource that they can use and exploit. And that's the case, not just in the US, but across all of these 61 countries that have already signed deals with the Chinese to deploy 5G, and all of the others that are testing. So this is a way to flip the model.
The challenge, obviously, and Declan raises some interesting things. I think we tell you from our experiences, there are quite a few other reasons why those 61 countries have signed deals.
I like my simpler explanation.
With the Chinese. There are structurally some problems, and I think, once again, I would return to the notion that We have been, as Western suppliers and governments, competing with one another, understandably, for the business, but we have not been sufficient in providing a full ecosystem solution that goes across multiple sectors, that utilizes the resources of the various governments. The government of Finland, where we are headquartered, has caught on to this and has been very supportive in many of the countries working with us diplomatically to position the entire Finnish IT ecosystem, which is much bigger than you would think. In the aftermath of Nokia's handset failure, there was a lot of organic growth and startups and web scale and apps. And so there's an ecosystem to position. And where we show up and we do that, we win deals. So there's a lesson there, which is that a little closer collaboration between Western suppliers and governments can go a long way. That's the last thing that I would say is I think what makes me somewhat skeptical of the wholesale approach is more pragmatic, which is you're talking about cultural acceptance and adherence to a particular pricing strategy for most of our customers. It's neither right nor wrong. I mean, it probably is right or wrong, but I'm not casting that judgment. What I would tell you is that the discussion about whether to pursue that type of policy objective and the implementation of that will take some time. Doesn't mean it's not a worthy discussion. It just means that the die is being cast now for what 5G will look like in the next 6 months. And so I think we are putting our focus on what can we do to provide a real alternative to developing countries to keep their markets open for Western suppliers.
Karl?
Yeah, I hear you about taking a long time, but there is something out there that will help the movement towards a wholesale open access market, and that is the customers. American Trucking Association, for example, endorses this. Why? Because they're paying AT&T and Verizon to send 10,000 pieces of information a day from the average 18-wheeler moving on America's highways, and they know what it's costing them. And if there's a way to get it done cheaper, they'd like to do it cheaper because, again, when that truck is moving across US 90 through West Texas, it's not just simply paying AT&T and Verizon. It's paying the charge on West Texas Telephone. 10 largest farm groups in America want an open access wireless market. Why? Because they're getting hit hard by the cost of wireless. The largest rural electric co-ops in the country, one of their officials told me, if we had this market, we would give away wireless meters free because you're telling me we can tap that meter at 1 o'clock in the morning if we've got coverage rather than paying the freight to AT&T. Large, I don't want to use the name of it, but a very large commercial company that sends billions of pieces of data a day through wireless, AT&T, and pays bills to Verizon and AT&T and so forth. I happen to be talking to the CEO as a personal friend on an entirely different issue. When we finished what he wanted to talk about, I said, I'd love for an introduction to your CTO to talk about this. He said, well, tell me what this is. Explain it. When I finished, he said literally, hold on, I'm getting him on the line with us. Because he said, you cannot imagine how much money we spend each year to communicate the information about our business and how much it costs us. And you're telling me that I could find a way to get that cheaper. So there's a customer base out there that is going to be open to adaptation if there's a nationwide open access network. Hell, they'll be amenable to it even if there's a regional network, because they're sitting there saying, my choice is to pay a price that is dictated to me versus a price that I can bid for. And particularly if it is time sensitive or not time sensitive, there's a big implication for that. So I agree with you. It's going to take a while, but from what I'm seeing out there, and it's limited obviously, there is a market for it because of how much people are now spending. They may not be able to articulate that we pay that big a chunk per gigabyte compared to the rest of the world, but they know instinctively it's a big cost for their business and they'd like to lower it.
Did you want to say something?
Sure. One of the great strengths of America is precisely the openness of our markets, the ability of companies to tailor their offerings to meet consumer requirements. Economics is really based on the idea that supply follows demand and not the other way around. So it's the American consumer, it's the American businesses that want wireless services, that want communication services, that will determine the way in which it is provided. And the greatest way to support the development of really any service is to make precise property rights, to enforce those property rights. Nobel laureate Ronald Coase famously wrote about the importance of that. Yes, there are transaction costs, and there are a lot of transaction costs in all these businesses, but ultimately, the way to make the American consumer better off is to focus a lot on the property rights. One of the things we haven't discussed up here today, which I know is a big concern to all the manufacturers working in this business, is the protection of property rights. There is wide-scale theft of intellectual property rights that just compound some of the problems that are going on in this business. And that's one area where I think our government could take an even stronger role. It's taken a stronger role than probably any administration in recent decades has taken, but at the same time, there's a long way to go, and the problems of the deployment of 5G are also problems of getting stronger property rights in place.
I was going to say, ironically, on the IP point, we spent the last few years of the Obama administration turning back pushes and efforts from what I call the Silicon Valley Free Lunch Society to alter dramatically how we protect intellectual property, particularly as it relates to standards essential patents. For us, you don't make money off of sending engineers to standards bodies, except to the extent that you create share time and technology, and you're able to license that technology. So far from respecting and protecting property rights, we spent a good deal of time making it much more difficult for us to justify investment in this. Thankfully, this administration has turned its attentions to a more fair and balanced approach to IP enforcement. But you also had the Section 301 investigation, which pointed out clearly that it remains an ongoing challenge to get a bilateral enforcement and respect for intellectual property with China and other places. So that is, I often am quoted when I say, we policymakers need to stop doing stupid things. That was a stupid thing, to weaken intellectual property rights ahead of a huge wave of new technology that the people needed to underwrite investment in. We think things like net neutrality, which overly restrict the ability of carriers to monetize through things like prioritization and experimental pricing models. These are the kinds of policy things that make it much more difficult on operators to monetize, on us to generate return on our investment in technology, and all of those things inure great benefits to the Chinese model because we cannibalize ourselves.
I can't emphasize the intellectual properties issue with new technologies and emerging technologies enough. We had a whole conference here with the Quantum Alliance Initiative on quantum technology and intellectual property and how important protecting and strengthening those kinds of rights and patents are and the right kinds of use of patents, not as a defensive measure to shut down innovation by others and competition, and how important that is for advancing and then moving forward with commercialization of these kinds of emerging technologies. Hugely important. Should we open it up to questions from the audience? Let's do that. What I'd like you to do is, when you raise your hand, just wait for a microphone to come around so everyone will be able to hear your question. And then if you can just identify yourself and divulge what you're willing to do of your affiliation, and we'll be happy to hear your question. So we have a question there with the young lady, and then we have two questions over here as well.
Hello, Eliza, student. Thank you so much for joining us, but I want to say that much of the discussion, both today and in general, is about competition. It's ultimately this premise that we're in a tech race. You see Ian Bremmer say that there's an AI Cold War. So I kind of want to challenge this notion just a little bit, and I was wondering if there's actually room for collaboration between the US and China, and if so, where?
I think so. I think it begins coming out of the Section 301 investigation. We've gotten a bit off the rails in terms of what remedies were actually sought and the approach here, but I think the message to China was ultimately, let's work together on bilateral enforcement of intellectual property. I think Nokia has been extremely successful in China. In fact, we have the largest market share of Western suppliers in that market. We win deals there. We're respected by the Chinese government. And part of the reason is that we're collaborative. We say to them, for example, when they were still eschewing participating in standards bodies, look, instead of coming in and mandating a particular encryption mechanism for China, bring it to the standards body. Let's have a better encryption mechanism. And you guys are now interested in exporting your technology to other markets. As long as you are seen as someone that doesn't respect intellectual property rights, are engaged in cyber espionage, as long as you're not participating in standardization, you've got these indigenous innovation policies, you're not going to be terribly welcome in other markets. And we've been successful in getting engagement from the Chinese government to recognize that they need to conform more, as much as their economic model will allow them to, frankly, to more Western trade norms. We have not done enough of that. We have not done that at a bilateral government level, but we think there's opportunity to do that instead of treating everything as though it's, as you said, a Cold War.
I'm going to let every one of the panelists answer that important question and take a shot at it.
I have a very dubious view of the Chinese willingness to cooperate on any basis other than outright theft. Look at their trade-related investment measures. Look at their approach to licensing, in which you have to have a Chinese partner, and after that partnership breaks up, they retain the license to your technology. Look at their procurement rules. You've got to, you want to sell lots to the Chinese government, you got to produce it in China with a Chinese partner, and the Chinese partner has access to all your technology. I thought the administration did a very good thing in March by filing its action at the WTO on intellectual property. I wish they backed it with a diplomatic initiative to get every other country which has IP rights around the world that they're concerned about losing in China to join with us in that action. That's the way to get the Chinese to abide by the rules, get the rest of the world to insist on it. The WTO is a good venue for this because, in fact, it's probably the only good venue for this because when we started putting these rules into place in the 1990s, there was no internet, there was all of these technical questions with regard to a lot of the intellectual property that we're dealing with today we weren't even asking ourselves those questions. This is the place to rally the world to get it, and my sense is the world is very interested in getting respect for its IP rights inside China.
And would it be fair to say, Karl, that we have tried and bent over backwards on the cooperation route with China for 2 decades or more, including subsidizing a lot of the technological development, including infrastructure within China, and that the real problem has not that level of cooperation
this problem is getting worse.
has made things worse.
Yeah, this problem is getting worse. There's no evidence whatsoever that the Chinese have stopped stealing technology from any source they can get it. There are stories about rifling through people's people's phones and computers at international meetings of industry experts just so they can steal information. I mean, this is a continuing pattern on their part, and there's little that they've done to gain the trust of the rest of the world, which frankly is an advantage to us right now if we turn it to our advantage.
So I'll give you one example. We were involved in a bid in a Latin American country. 3 days before our bid submission, our bid boxes were being delivered to our office in downtown, very Tony neighborhood. And the vehicle carrying our bid boxes with 2 members of my staff in it was hijacked at gunpoint, and the bid boxes were stolen out of the trunk. And now I don't think it's because the thieves, valued good carpentry. This is sharp-elbowed stuff, and we cannot be naive in understanding what the stakes are here. China has an opportunity by the end of February to effectively have won the control and domination, a preponderance of power in one of the 5 strategic domains: land, sea, air, space, cyber. The lowest hanging fruit The one that they are closest to winning, they're not going to have a deep, blue ocean navy that's capable of for quite some time, but they are this close to winning this 5G cyber domain footprint globally. 61 countries have already signed, and it's more than one carrier in multiple of those countries, connecting every devices in your home and in your car, and that applies to everybody. They know what they're doing. It's absolutely brilliant. It's almost unprecedented. So, as Ronald Reagan said, my plan to answer for that strategically would be, we win, they lose. And the only way we win is if we flip the model, this broken business model that we've been stuck in of auctions won by what have become rent-seeking carriers who are propping up price to the point where the US is paying the highest prices in the world. This is an idiot situation that we've put ourselves into. We have to change that model. The carriers aren't going to change it themselves. My friend from Nokia here, who I've never met before today, by the way, is right. They're not going to lead the change. The lead has to come from somewhere else. And the options are available. The only country in the world at this point, this wasn't the case 2 years ago, but now, the only country that can flip the model and start that process is the United States. The UK isn't going to do it. Australia's not big enough to do it. The Canadians aren't going to do it. So it's the US. And we have until the end of February to do it. And it really is a case. It's really a case of we win, they lose. They want to dominate this. It's not a secret. They've said it. We have to stop them. And the way we stop them is with a better, smarter business model that financial markets and private money is willing to back. And that does exist.
With all of that said, I would just return back to the Section 301 situation, because I think here,
What is Section 301?
so the investigation that was done, that was referred to earlier in the year, alleging a long-running pattern of intellectual property theft and abuses by the Chinese, which has in turn given rise to the imposition of tariffs and other things to encourage a change in Chinese behavior. I think the question many of us have now is, what is the exit strategy there for the administration? You can take a position one direction or another. There's some folks that believe the United States government and governments, and for that matter in many other parts of the world, have had an accommodationist strategy towards the Chinese for 2 or 3 decades, and that it hasn't yielded a change in behavior, that you're unlikely to get them to adopt market norms. And others believe something fundamentally different. But the fact is, if the tariffs were going to work, what is it we're asking the Chinese to do? It's unclear to me at this point that we have articulated for them changes in their behavior which would lead to a de-escalation. And it seems to me that, if you have to have an exit ramp and then spot the exit ramp, and it's unclear to me that we have that at the moment. The strange part of that is that we've just imposed in the 3rd round of those tariffs duties on the bulk of the infrastructure that will be building 5G networks in the United States. That hardly seems a sensible policy, and it's what I meant when I said let's not do stupid things. Let's not make it even more expensive or require rejiggering of people's entire supply chains in order to evade duties, which will delay the availability of the equipment. There doesn't appear to be a coherent exit strategy that could get to Chinese change behavior, and I think that's got to be where it starts. The team at the White House has to articulate to China, you want to de-escalate? These are the things you have to do. I have not heard an expression publicly of what those things are.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's not clear what the strategy is or how you get from tariffs to an acceptance of a new intellectual property regime, which is why I think if there's an action, and there are actions that can be taken to open the door to an open access wireless network, that's a good opening step. But the next steps are, I think, all on the international front. It's pursuing the case that was filed in March and lining up additional support around the world in favor of the position of forcing the Chinese through the WTO to agree to abide by the international standards regarding intellectual property. Far better than saying we're going to slap $200 billion worth of tariffs on you unless you change these 10 things. I'd rather be focused on going to the body where they're obligated to honor its decisions and outcomes.
Principles first. Principles first, actions next.
Yeah.
If I could just quickly address the question about whether collaboration with the Chinese would help. First of all, for those of us of a certain age, collaboration has a certain pejorative tone, certain pejorative meaning. And the issue from a consumer is consumers want competition. They don't want businesses to collaborate. Technologies don't come from countries. They don't come from governments. They don't even come from companies, really. They come from engineers. They come from people with ideas, with better ideas. The greatest friend any consumer ever had is a competitor. It's someone walking down the street saying, I can give you a better product. If suddenly those collections of engineers begin to collaborate and sort of say, oh, well, actually, let's not compete. Let's go take a vacation. We're not really going to be here to compete. That is the worst thing that can ever happen for a consumer in any business. And so the idea really is, how do you get to a situation, 1G, the wireless industry was built by dozens of companies around the world competing head to head, engineers staying up months on end trying to come up with a better product, get it to market as quickly as possible. It did not develop with engineers collaborating and sort of saying, well, let's just get together and do this. This competition is what is the key role for consumers and for the advancement of technology.
Fair competition.
I'm going to make sure we have time for the other questions we've got. And we've got the two over here, please. And then we've got a third that's a hand and a fourth hand that's popping up.
Great. Thank you very much. My name is Zach Cinemenis. I'm from a public affairs firm called Advanced Advocacy. So this question is for Mr. Furchtgott-Roth. Thank you, and I hope I didn't completely butcher your name there. But also welcome many of the other panelists' thoughts on this too. So there's been a lot of discussion from the distinguished panel on network security, a little bit of chip security, the implications of Chinese rising tide of their influence. But what about as it pertains to spectrum security? So I wanted to get kind of, if you could expand on that, who's worrying about it, who's responsible for it, and above just the pie in the sky implications of it, how can we take some tangible steps forward to ensure global security of spectrum? Thank you.
By spectrum security, do you mean not having third parties eavesdropping on communications? Is that what you mean by spectrum security? It's a big problem. I'm not sure I want to, this may be a better question to talk to me offline because we could go on for hours about this. Leave it, let me just say that it's a very serious problem. There's a lot of security breaches that go on with wireless communications. So a lot of security breaches go on with wireline communications as well. Security is a very big problem that has not yet been solved.
I can speak a little bit to this. We had a discussion earlier among some of us about standardization and where are things going now. And I made the point that security there's a trade-off, particularly when we're talking about wireless network, between security and how much radio resources available to serve the subscriber. We could make a very, 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 very secure radio head, but it might not have very much capacity left to actually give services, which is not to excuse not having security. It's just that we are also looking backwards over the previous generations as we design the equipment for 5G to think about where did we maybe fall on the wrong side of some of those choices in previous generations. So for example, you have IMSI catching opportunities with LTE where you could essentially put a fake base station between the user and his cell tower and spoof the device into disclosing its location and intercepting the call. Part of that was making a trade on radio resource availability versus security for LTE. That particular issue is being addressed in the first release for 5G. We are focused on layering security for 5G. So we'll never be perfect, in terms of how we minimize, but we're making it as difficult as possible. Another one that was obvious in LTE, which is fourth generation, is the control channels for the radios were fairly narrow, and it opened it up to something called smart jamming, which is a bit of a challenge when you consider we're building a national public safety wireless network in LTE. So that's an issue that had to be addressed again. So you're constantly looking backwards at vulnerabilities and things that existed in the previous technology to figure out how you can make things more secure moving forward. Now, the good news with 5G is the options box is even bigger, right? The challenges are different and in some cases bigger, but all of the tools that we've had before, things like isolating individual network elements to protect them, all of the firewalls, all of those things are still part of the options set. But we're also going to be introducing things into 5G like AI, machine learning, sort of adaptive security measures where you're actually taking people out of the equation because, if a person has to log into a network, sometimes they bypass their credentials or whatever. We want to make networks more self-adaptive to security challenges that happen. So we're being very cognizant of challenges from the past. But that said, there will be new threats which emerge. And we have to be responsive as an industry in doing that. And I guess the last point is we also have to ask tough questions of the carriers, who are my customers after all. We do a lot through the standards bodies to develop security approaches, which we are required to support in the equipment. But there isn't always a follow-on requirement that they actually deploy all of those security tools that are developed through standardization. So we have to be smart about making sure that they have the right incentive mix. We're not in favor of command and control, but there has to be something looked at in order to make security a priority and incentivize making sure we deploy all the tools that we're developing.
Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have two questions on this side, and then we're going to finish up.
Carlos Avillon, I'm an economist, I'm a researcher, and the question would be for Mr. Roth, the economist, and Mr. Rove on national security. The reason why China has become a challenger and a threat on telecommunications is the same reason why it has become a challenger and a threat on the military side, because its economy has grown so much faster in the last 40 years relative to the US and other Western nations. And as long as this growth gap continues, this situation will get worse on numerous fields of technology, which have national security implications. So the question is are you trying to develop a new growth theory that could supply to the US a faster rate of growth than the one of the last 10 years, which has been just of about 2% annually? China during that same period has grown at 8%. That gap is just colossal. And I'm saying that because I think 2 weeks ago, Nobel Prize in Economics was given to Paul Romer from New York University. And great reason for that was because he's been saying that economics doesn't have a mechanism to guarantee fast and sustained economic growth for any nation in the world, which is the reason why they call it the dismal science. And that there's a reason for new ideas, but nobody's coming up with new ideas. So I'm wondering if you as a think tank have been trying to develop new ideas, and Mr. Rove, even in his within the Republican Party, are there new ideas trying to attack directly this problem?
Okay, I'm going to phrase that question slightly differently if I can, so to fit with where we are, and I'll do it this way, and that is in terms of winning the 5G sweepstakes with China, to what degree are we looking at economic factors, and to what degree are we looking at political factors as far as what drives this competition?
I think the answer is both and all of the above. All these factors are important. but I think the question is a good one in terms of economic growth is going to drive demand for new services, and as long as China is growing faster, it still is not as large as the American economy, but projections are in the next 10 years it will catch and exceed the United States if it continues on the same growth path. There's no question, I think in my view, there's no question the greatest national security asset the United States could deploy is to get to faster economic growth. And I think it's a very simple solution, which is less regulation, lower taxes, do things to define and enforce property rights. Those are the things that I think most economists over time have agreed on. I think the administration is taking steps in those directions. There's a lot more that can be done. But I would say that over the past 10 years, economic growth in the United States has been less than 2% on average. But in the past 12 months, we've seen 3% growth. The economy is picking up. We are having less regulation. We are having lower taxes, and we are having greater definition of property rights. Karl?
If I could take the other angle of that, I agree that we need to do things that are to hasten growth here in the United States, but I think we also make a mistake if we just look at this as a question of China versus the U.S., and that China has emerged as an adversary for the United States simply because it's grown. It's emerged as an adversary of the United States because it's chosen to be an adversary of the United States. Just read Xi's comments at the 19th Congress, and I mean, I thought it was interesting. A couple weeks ago, the administration said, "Well, we're going to think about imposing the tariffs." And what was Xi's response? He sends a message to the military departments in the South China Sea to make further preparations against the possibility of war. I mean, that's a guy who's out to have a conflict. And I also look at it in terms of not just the U.S. versus China, but in essence, the Western world versus China. The interests of the United States are similar in this situation economically to a lot of our friends, longtime friends in Europe, and they're certainly similar to the people in the region. You think Vietnam is really excited about an aggressive China? The Philippines, Japan, Korea. I mean, a large part of the region is concerned about what they're seeing as the Chinese advances in the South China Sea and the Chinese attitudes towards them. So we've got allies out there if we choose to avail ourselves of them, both economically and
from an world economic growth perspective. You know, you have that metaphor, right? Rising tide lifts all boats.
Right.
For Bryan, for Declan, if you look at the contrast between a Western model for 5G technology versus the Chinese model for technology, which one is more likely to boost economic growth and prosperity for other countries, and which one is going to subordinate the economic growth and prosperity of other countries to the advantage of one country in particular?
Well, the problem is the Western model for 5G at the moment is the Chinese model, and we have to change that. We have to allow price discovery to take place on bandwidth. Right to your point of economic growth, if you drop the price, if you drop the average price of a gigabit in the United States of America, somewhere between where it is now, one of the highest in the world, to zero, and you drop it enough, but you increase consumption or demand by fact of that drop, the economic shot in the arm that would give the US economy and any other economy that would introduce it would be significant. Now, we've run numbers on those and had economists independently run numbers on what that would do, and it will have a very significant impact on GDP. We saw the introduction of basic wireless technology and what it did to GDPs across the world, introducing price discovery on bandwidth, where you allow that price to drop and find its natural level in alliance with demand. That will become a huge stimulus, equivalent to perhaps a significant tax cut, because it affects everybody. Every single person in this room, everybody that you know, is paying X amount a month. You drop that bill by, you half that bill, you add millions and millions of new devices of demand that are paying a bit less. The economic stimulus that adds to an economy, I think, could be quite significant. So I think Seeing bandwidth as a commodity and allowing it to be priced as a commodity, I think has potential to have economic impact that will be measurable on GDP. We saw the introduction of wireless and how it had a measurable impact on GDP in the past. Allowing price discovery, dynamic wholesale markets to come into being, I think will have an economic stimulus effect.
So just, I'm going to take my Nokia hat off, excuse me, just for a moment, because I think, as you mentioned, I've spent a fair amount of time in the Senate as a staff director, so I would couch my policy answers this way. With respect to what's going on at the moment, you know, the best way to win a race is to recognize that you're actually in one. And I'm not sure, as you go around the U.S. government at the moment, there's a full appreciation for exactly the race that we're in, not just with respect to 5G, but as you mentioned, with respect to policies around growth. In Congress, you know, the policy choices are framed as binary choices between this or that. It's no regulation or it's this kind of regulation, instead of looking for things like flexible regulation, right? Nobody wants poison air or water. But we also have to recognize that when you're dealing with a competitor that's growing at 3 or 4 times the rate that you're growing, there are costs imposed on the system in terms of your dexterity, your ability to do things as a business quickly in response to this. We built out LTE in China in 18 months, which is very difficult to comprehend, except when you start realizing that there are some advantages to a command economy, right? They have different land use policy, for example. You didn't have to deal with 39,000 towns in order to get the network deployed. You know, you need a national spectrum band cleared like mid-band. Well, there it is, 100 megahertz for each operator, go. We don't have those choices available to us, nor should we want to be a command economy. That's not what I'm suggesting. But we have to move with greater purpose in some of these areas. You have to be able to look and say, okay, where do they have strategic advantages? Land use policy, check. FCC, you know, under Chairman Pai and President Trump have done a lot of things to speed deployment in the United States relative to 5G. Spectrum, we still have a bit of a mess. You know, we don't have plans to get some of those mid-bands deployed on a timeline that's going to make us competitive with Asia. And we've had a lot of meetings like this and panels like this over the last 9 months. They're wonderful. Thank you for the invitation. But that has to be translated into actual action, right? There has to be a national strategy for dealing with the information technology economy, the telecommunications economy, and recognizing there are limits that we have in our system. So we have to move with greater purpose and speed to take advantage of the things that we have, because the other country that we've mentioned many times here, it can move with all the speed that it wants to implement those policies, and we're still arguing about what's the scope of the problem. Meanwhile, the die is starting to be cast, as Declan said. I don't know if February, you know, Mobile World Congress is the sort of point of no return, but the die is definitely being cast, and we're still, you know, we're still in the paddock waiting to go to the racetrack, and that doesn't show that we really appreciate the economic race that we're in.
Let's go to our last 3 questions.
Thank you. Dave Ribinowitz, I'm a retired engineer. And by the way, engineers do collaborate. Business people compete. Engineers are more interested in making progress than making money. But my question is, if you look at 4G and below...
We can do both.
Well, if you look at 4G and below, you're thinking about cell towers every few miles or whatever it is. But for 5G, and especially urban 5G, it's more like Wi-Fi. You've got a whole bunch of small stations. A building like this would have a whole bunch of separate base stations. And in theory, the owner of the building could install the Wi-Fi system himself and then rent the capacity to the carriers. And the question is, under the current regulatory environment, is that possible?
So this will be interesting, and then I'll let Declan, this is totally his wheelhouse, I would imagine. I think you're going to see a very interesting thing happen in 5G, which is these questions are they're starting to be asked at the tail end of LTE with the idea of things like private LTE networks for certain applications, and we're happy to sell all the equipment in the world to people that would like to do this. But the enterprise customers themselves have started to say, okay, Nokia, if you make all the gear that I need to connect to the network and have in-building coverage and capability, and you're going to sell me the applications and the analytics, and I'm going to get the same technology solution from you that I'm going to get if I buy 5G as a service from a carrier, why do I need a carrier? I don't know the extent to which that will actually materialize. I do know that we have an enterprise business and an enterprise strategy which is focused on, you pick your carrier to do the transport, but in terms of on-site for all the things that you need, it's not a foregone conclusion in 5G that involves a carrier.
Markets respond to incentives. First of all, on your comment on engineers, I actually have found that indeed. I say to my own engineers sometimes, you told them what? When they talk to their engineering colleagues from some of our commercial competitors. I think you raise a very interesting point, and I think within the point that you raised about the incentive for a private property owner to do something to create capacity is because they can make some money out of it. And I think right in the heart of that thought is the answer to the problem with all of these 32,000 or whatever it is municipalities, where they're being told, clear the way, you're just going to have to, we're mandating that you have to allow this to be rolled out, and that's good, and it makes us a bit more like China in terms of we're issuing a command, which perhaps is less good. But wouldn't it be interesting if a municipality wanted somebody to deploy because they were going to get a piece of the action, a piece of the revenue that was being generated off their piece of real estate? Now, currently, the way we run the wireless industry doesn't even contemplate such a thing. Allow somebody like a major hotel operator to have a piece of the action for the traffic that goes over the network that they help enable by making sites available. I think that there's a lot there. I think it will happen. I think it's going to take time. It's not going to happen fast enough to solve the immediate problem. But I think that you're being quite visionary in what you've pointed out there, and I think there's within that statement is a long-term answer to how we fund wireless infrastructure deployment in terms of points of presence in the future by making it worth that guy's while to put that capacity there because he's going to get a piece of the action.
Question here. Sam?
Thank you. Katie Wang with Newtown Dynasty TV. Just wonder if you have communicated your concerns to the Trump administration on this, the technology, this 5G issue, and how's their response to that, and will they take any concrete actions?
You're asking me?
Any of you?
Yes, for some time now. We have flagged, I think, a couple of dimensions, one of which is, what we consider to be unfair competition and lack of engagement to the whole China solution that we're seeing other places, and encouraging the U.S. government diplomatically to get involved in this space. I think I would say this year in particular, the last 4 or 5 months, you've seen a lot of engagement from the administration. We had the 5G summit at the White House, which, as events of that, there was the sort of what everybody saw, the retail PR version of that, but there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to frame actionable things that can be done on security, on, as I mentioned, the standardization approach. We've shared all of those ideas that I outlined to NIST and to others in the administration about how you encourage more involvement in standardization from the America side. It's very receptive to that, lots of follow-up happening. So I'm more confident than I have been in some time that the scope of the problems is understood. As I mentioned with the tariff issue, it's not always clear to me that the tool chosen is the most constructive tool in the world, but we're working on that too. But I think the engagement and awareness level at the National Security Council, National Economic Council, Office of Science and Technology Policy, NIST, is very high. I think we've shared a lot of ideas with them.
My answer to your question would be yes.
Oh.
For those of you who underneath our equipment during trade shows, taking photographs and so on. It really happens. This is not an esoteric issue, and certainly not in telecommunications. My question, just as a kind of roundup question, is I think there's consensus that this is something that needs to be acted on fairly quickly. Exactly how much time we have is debate. Is there something, I'd like to hear from as many of you as possible, is there one or two things you'd specifically like to see happen in the next 3, 6 months from either the United States government or other people that's not happening now that would allow us to have a better shot at avoiding this Chinese domination or lack of leadership in 5G?
Got to define what a win means and looks like. So I know one of the things that worries the national security establishment of the United States greatly is what if China wins the race to 5G? And my question always to them is, what does that mean? Does that mean they deploy first? Does that mean there's a huge lag until a fully evolved 5G gets deployed? So just as an example, US carriers are poised with spectrum in hand to do early stage 5G deployments in the United States. Those will give you capabilities of maybe 2 gigabits per second, lowering of latency, but that's not fully evolved 5G, right? They don't have the assets that they need right now in the way of spectrum to really upgrade that and evolve that towards that 10 to 20 gigabit per second zero latency model. China does, Japan will, South Korea will. And if they get there first, and there's an appreciable gap before the US gets there, then most of those use cases that I described, web scale, the verticals, connected healthcare, intelligent transportation, the development work for that is going to go where the networks support those use cases. So an area where the United States enjoys tremendous economic advantage at the moment could be under threat. That, I think, is ultimately, because we've asked the question, what are you worried about? Really boils down to that. We can close the gap on the initial deployment, but the things we have to do, aside from what Declan's talking about with flipping the model, assuming you don't flip the model, what can you do in the next 6 months or so to shrink the gap both on that early deployment, but certainly on the pathway to that full evolved 5G? We've already done the siting reform, that's tremendous. You got to get mid-band spectrum cleared and into the market. You got to complete these auctions, accelerate them where you can, and you got to find ways to incentivize, more U.S. and America's entities to show up and participate in standardization to make sure that this remains a place that the best engineering decisions are made that drive this. You also have to start thinking and providing the incentives to think about research into a post-quantum world, right? We know that certain other countries, we've named quite a bit here, are working on quantum communications capability. We're focused on 5G, but we aren't thinking enough about a world in which communications technologies exist side by side, the ability to quickly break encryption ciphers, and what technology, what's the research strain, the evolutionary thing working there. There's not enough focus from the US about how to encourage that next generation of R&D.
And I'm going to say something here because this touches on my wheelhouse, which is on the quantum technology side. And from speaking from that angle, one of the things that I would like to see, may not be the primary goal, but it could be a pivot point, is more concentration on making 5G technology networks quantum capable so that they are able to incorporate quantum technology going forward over the next decade and a half to 2 decades. From a cost standpoint, my experts say this is not going to be that much more costly. We're talking about pennies on the dollar in order to bring in that capability. But that will demand 2 things. It'll demand a standard of what constitutes quantum capability, a minimum standard in that area. And also, I think it's an area in which you can say, here is an advantage. If we have that kind of quantum capability built into the standards for 5G, that will be an advantage that we have over Chinese competitors. Because other countries are not going to be in a situation where in 15 years, 20 years, they're going to have to dig up all their fiber optic networks in order to install ones that are going to be quantum safe, and that's not where you want to go. Karl, Declan, and then Harold.
Well, I just say that the government needs to take steps that make the likelihood of an open access wireless network in the United States more real and sooner. And as it was said, I think earlier, in order to win the race, you got to figure out you're in the race. My sense is people throughout the government have figured out we're in a race, and they're figuring out how we can make certain that we win that race. And the time is running out.
61 countries already have made the decision. That's going to be at 80 plus very, very quickly. Latin America will be gone. Europe will be gone. Asia will be gone. I mean, okay, maybe we can get Antarctica or somewhere. We flipped the model. I think we have to do it before Mobile World Congress, because ministers and companies and banks and international funding organizations will be making decisions by then. Many of them have already been made. Lots of announcements are planned for Mobile World Congress by the Chinese, some of which we know about, some of which probably we don't. That's the moment. You have to flip the model. You have to create doubt. You have to spike the model that's damaging us right now. And the only way you do that is with a better idea. There is one out there, but it needs to be flipped between now and the end of February. Otherwise, I think it's irreversible. I want to be wrong about that.
I want to echo what Karl was saying about coming up with a plan. At the end of the day, markets are what work. It's one of the strengths of America. But I think the discussion that we're hearing today is that in China there's a very close relationship between communications companies, manufacturers, and the government. A much closer relationship than exists here in the United States, where essentially there is no relationship at all. And at the end of the day, I think what we're hearing is the following challenge. Do markets work? Are markets superior to a situation where government and business have a very cozy relationship and engage in game theoretic strategies to do better than markets? America always stands with the market. America always stands with the things that reinforce markets. And if we're in a situation, though, where game theoretic approaches of a strong government can trump a market, then we're in very serious trouble. And I think that's the way our government needs to think about it. Is there some countermeasure that our government can take to preserve the superiority of the market system that is the strength of America?
Karl, you're going to get the last
Yeah, let me just add a quick word here. I don't mean to disagree with my colleague Declan, but he's Irish, so he's a half, glass half empty kind of guy. I'm Norwegian, and since we spent many a lovely spring and summer visiting Ireland and my forebears, we're a glass half full kind of people. And yeah, we got 61 countries that have signed agreements, but these agreements are reversible in many instances, because underneath it all are those original strengths. Chinese equipment, Chinese security questions, Chinese financing, a model that fundamentally is not durable over the long haul. And so I'm optimistic that if the U.S. government does move and a new model begins to emerge before Barcelona, that a lot of people are going to say, you know what? We want an alternative to Huawei and ZTE, and we don't want to become indebted to the Chinese, and we want to strengthen the Nokias and the Ericssons and the Samsungs of the world, so that we're dealing with private sector companies that are competing against each other in a market to develop something better, rather than state subsidized, state run, and state dominated and state financed companies in China.
You know how I know that this was not just a good panel, but a great panel?
The fact that everybody sat here for 2 hours.
Well, the fact that we ran over half an hour longer, and virtually everyone stayed in his or her seat.
And we made
the
a
whole
note
thing. And
of
we still have
everybody
more
who left.
questions.
And we didn't even lock the doors.
Anyway, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Rivada Networks for their help in sponsoring this event, and also for Quantum Alliance Initiative. And this is our opportunity for all of us in the audience and all of us who've appreciated our session today to thank our panelists.
Say hi to the boss for me. I will. Give her my best.